Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Douglas Gell, and I'm the foreign editor here at the Washington Post. And I'm so pleased to introduce Anna Fifield, the Post's Beijing bureau chief, who's the author of the brand new book, The Great Successor, a timely, behind-the-scenes look at one of the world's most elusive dictators, Kim Jong Un. Anna's extraordinary reporting traces his ascension and its roots through 3 generations of family rule in North Korea that began with his grandfather, Kim Il-sung. The Great Successor is almost certainly the most complete portrait we have of Kim Jong Un to date, providing vital insight into the mind and motivations of a young, mercurial, and still mysterious leader. It makes a compelling case for understanding Kim as a rational and methodical actor on the world stage without diminishing the cruelty of his regime and the dangers it poses. Before moving to China a year ago, Anna covered Japan and the Koreas for the Post. Over the course of her career, she has reported from more than 20 countries and has visited North Korea a dozen times. She was a Nieman Fellow at the Harvard University studying how change happens in closed societies, and last year she received the Shorenstein Award from Stanford University for her outstanding reporting on Asia. I can think of no better person to speak with Anna than Washington Post foreign affairs columnist David Ignatius. Their conversation this morning will be followed by a panel discussion about current U.S. relations with North Korea with the noted Korean Peninsula expert Victor Cha and the Washington Post David Nakamura and Carol Morello. The Great Successor will be available for purchase after the program, so stick around to get your copy signed by Anna. And before we begin, I want to point out the striking timeliness of this book's publication and our program this morning. We're exactly 1 year out from that historic summit that brought President Trump and Kim Jong Un together in Singapore. So thanks again for being here, and please join me in welcoming David Ignatius and Anna Fifield to the Post Live stage.
So thank you so much to Doug. This is really a treat for me as a Post journalist. Anna really is, as Doug suggested, the gold standard in coverage of North Korea. To give you a sense of that, I'm going to read you a blurb on the back of this book. We authors always like to get blurbs from people, but rarely one as extraordinary as this. Evan Osnos, who's writing, I'm sure many of you know, in the New Yorker, has written brilliantly about Asia and North Korea, says, "There is quite simply no journalist in any language who's done more to unearth and tell the astounding story of Kim Jong Un than Anna Fifield." So that's our author this morning. And I want to open with your big scoop that has been getting reactions from President Trump and a lot of other people on page 213 of this book, no doubt set in print some many weeks ago. You write that Kim Jong-un's half-brother, Kim Jong-nam, quote, became an informant for the CIA, an agency with a track record of bringing down spies it didn't like. President Trump was asked about this yesterday. The report was picked up by the Wall Street Journal, and he said, "I saw the information about the CIA with respect to Kim Jong-un's brother or half-brother, and I would tell him that would not," meaning Kim Jong-un, "that would not happen under my auspices." In other words, if I understood the president forswearing recruiting agents to spy on a country that still threatens us with nuclear weapons, extraordinary statement. So let's start with the scoop and tell us what you can about this role as an informant that was played by Kim Jong-un, later murdered by his half-brother.
Thank you, David. Thank you for that introduction. So Kim Jong-nam was Kim Jong-un's older half-brother, and I think that the two of them never actually met. They lived entirely separate, cloistered childhoods. You know, Kim Jong-il had many families with different children, and he kept them all in different compounds in Pyongyang. And you know, even when they went to Switzerland, he sent Kim Jong-nam to Geneva and Kim Jong-un and his family to Bern. So these two had no relationship whatsoever. But having said that, it was still a real surprise that Kim Jong-un would order his half-brother's assassination, even for North Korea, in this very brutal way, having a chemical weapon applied to his face. He died within 20 minutes of that attack. And there was quite a lot of puzzlement about why he would do that. Kim Jong-nam had been living outside of North Korea for almost 2 decades by that stage. He'd been based in Macau, but he also had a base in Beijing. He had the protection of the Chinese. And he had really shown no interest whatsoever in the leadership of North Korea. But having said that, North Korea, the regime is founded on this very bizarre Paektu bloodline, this idea that the family descended from this holy mountain in the north of North Korea. So technically, Kim Jong-nam could be considered a rival to the leadership of North Korea because he had this Paektu blood running through his veins. But, you know, during the course of my reporting, I was told by a very reliable source that Kim Jong-nam had been an informant for the CIA in his final years. He had been meeting his handlers in Southeast Asia, in Malaysia or Singapore, around these places, and passing on what information he knew about his brother and the regime there. And even though he was in this kind of exile, he continued to have very good contacts at the top of the regime. He was very close to his uncle until Kim Jong-un had him killed at the end of 2013. But he had, his uncle was the North Korean ambassador to Malaysia. So he continued to have these high-level contacts. He could have been a good source of information. And the reporting is that he had met his handler in Malaysia in the days before his death, and he had $120,000 in cash in his backpack at the time of his death. So that would seem to give reason for Kim Jong-un to be even more concerned about him.
So that's really the question of the day, I would say. Is it your information, or would you assume that at the time of this grisly murder with a biological weapon, that Kim Jong-un was aware that his half-brother was, in effect, an asset of the CIA?
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's impossible to say, and I have spent the last 2 years trying to get into Kim Jong-un's head, which is a very scary place. But, you know, on so many levels, he has the Paektu blood. He had been openly criticizing the regime in encounters with Japanese journalists at airports around Asia. Plus, there was this factor. So if Kim Jong-un did know about this, yes, that is, I mean, all of these things are treasonous offenses in Kim Jong-un's eyes, and any one of them could be reason for him to feel he had to get rid of his brother.
And finally, if I could just ask you on this, what the likely effect of President Trump's remarkable statement, I wouldn't do that, would be for an agency, an American government, that is struggling every day to know as much as it can about North Korea that's closed and still threatening. This would have negative effects on efforts to gather information, wouldn't it?
Mm-hmm. I mean, one of the big challenges with North Korea, and different from other autocratic regimes, different from Iran or Libya under Gaddafi or whatever, is there's almost no human intelligence about North Korea. The CIA calls it the hardest of the hard targets. So if the CIA was in fact successful in recruiting Kim Jong-nam, that's a huge boon to them and to their understanding of the regime. So if I was somebody working at the CIA and I heard the president say that and seem to confirm that Kim Jong-nam was working for the CIA, I think I'd be quite demoralized by that.
So I want to turn now to the book. It's an extraordinary narrative, like a novel. It has an arc, and we'll get to where that arc goes. And to me, it was a surprising place. But I want to begin with a question of how you, as a journalist, put the story together. You say at one point early in the book that Kim Jong-un became an enduring obsession for you. obsessions are good things for journalists because it puts us in a place where we just gotta know the next fact. And walk this audience through your research into this amazing compound on the beach at Wonsan, where he and the other 1%ers of North Korea hung out. You're tracking stories about him to Switzerland, just how you assembled the narrative that's in the book.
Yeah, I mean, when I returned, I'd previously covered North Korea, and when I returned in 2014, I was just so astonished that this young guy, he was 27 years old when he took over, that he had been able to hold on to the leadership and to defy all of these expectations. And I wanted to try to figure out why. And, you know, as a reporter, I did what we do and went out and tried to report it out. So I tried to recreate his childhood and bring together as much information as I could about how he grew up, how he became this leader that he is today, how he justifies to himself all of the brutal things that he does to remain the leader. So I was living in Japan, and I found the Japanese sushi chef who had been living in the royal household. And this is like such a good illustration of how little we know about Kim Jong Un and the kinds of people whose brains we will tap to find out about him. Like, this is a very eccentric character, like somebody who left Japan during the boom years to move to North Korea. But he had this kind of access to Kim Jong Un at a very young age, and so he told me about the 8th birthday party where he was present, where Kim Jong Un was presented with a little general's uniform with epaulettes and gold stars, and he was called the little general. And real generals came into his birthday party and saluted to him. And then later, I managed to track down his aunt and uncle who had been his guardians in Switzerland, posing as his parents while he was at school there during his teenage years. And so they were able to confirm that for me. They were also at that birthday party, the 8th birthday party where he was named the successor. So I really just tried to set out to find every single person I could who'd ever had any kind of encounter with him. And of course, a lot of the stories are anecdotal or very superficial, but I was hoping to gather together, you know, anything we could add to this would increase our understanding of this man who is such a threat to the outside world.
One image that haunted me was that of Kim Jong Un at perhaps 11 or 12 as a schoolboy in Bern with an obsession for basketball. Every afternoon putting on his Chicago Bulls jersey with Michael Jordan's number. Talk to us about this weird basketball obsession that he had and how it culminated bizarrely in his diplomacy with Dennis Rodman, of all people, one of the weirdest characters ever to come out of the NBA.
Yeah. I mean, this is real. Like, he is a huge basketball fan. Every day after school in Bern, he was down at the high school shooting hoops, and nobody knew who he was. In fact, the Thai embassy was very close to this high school, so the other kids there just thought he was Thai. They didn't know. But they did think it was quite strange that there was often a little row of Korean and Asian adults sitting there on deck chairs cheering excessively every time he scored a point or whatever, and Kim Jong-un's trash talking the other things, so it was a little weird then. But he has been really...
What trash talk from Kim Jong-un, I'm trying to imagine whether he would call the other players dotards or what did he...
Maybe that word came later. But this started, his mother was a very powerful influence on him as a child, and this is something that's often overlooked. But it was actually his mother that got him into basketball, because there is a saying in Korean, and South Korean mothers to this day think that if you play basketball, you'll grow tall. So she wanted her son to grow tall, because Kim Jong-il was a very short guy, as we know. So she planted the seed in his head, and it did become, and he's taller than his father, so maybe it worked. I don't know.
And people knowing of this basketball obsession, including President Obama, have tried to send emissaries. I think it's right that Madeleine Albright sent, well, you tell the story.
Yeah, I have seen this basketball several times. There in North Korea, there is this huge, like, Buckingham Palace-style building that is the gift museum, which it displays all of the gifts that have ever been given to the leaders of North Korea. It's very bizarre. But in their pride of place is this NBA basketball signed by many players, Michael Jordan, that was delivered by Madeleine Albright when she went to meet Kim Jong Un there. So, you know, we don't know whether that was for the children or exactly how that was, but there is this strain of basketball there. And I think, you know, we laugh at Kim Jong Un inviting Dennis Rodman or allowing Dennis Rodman to come in with Vice News and things. But another thing I discovered during the course of my reporting is that this was a serious discussion at the CIA in those early years. And serious analysts I know went into the Oval Office and advised President Obama, like, this may be a way to forge a bridge to this North Korean leader. But it didn't go anywhere until Vice News came along.
So I want to turn to the narrative as Kim Jong Un becomes leader, becomes, as your title says, the great successor. I want to remind people in the audience or watching on streaming that if you have questions that you'd like me to ask Anna, the hashtag #PostLive will send them to me by a computer. So Kim Jong Un becomes the great successor in 2012. And he has extraordinary self-confidence right from the beginning. He speaks more than his father typically did. Give us a picture of the man who arrives in power, and then his course from there to what you describe in 2016 as the moment where he really plants his flag at home and abroad.
Yeah. So when he took over, he was only 27 years old, which is, you know, young anywhere, let alone in a hierarchical Confucian society like Korea's. And there was a lot of skepticism about whether he could do it, whether he could remain leader and keep it all together. And one of the surprising things, I think, is the fact that he did. He was very calculating and shrewd from the get-go in the way that he approached this job. He had a bunch of advisors. In fact, you know, many of the people who walked around his father's hearse with him at the funeral were people who had served his father. Some of them had served his grandfather. You know, the man right now who is the titular head of North Korea, he was foreign minister in 1984 when Kim Jong Un was born. So these people have served the regime for a long time. And we think they were his advisors. They helped him consolidate his rule. But he very ruthlessly got rid of all of these people one by one once they'd served their purpose for him. So that included his uncle who disappeared. That included the head of the army who had helped with the transition, the propaganda chief. Like, all of these eminence grise of the regime just disappeared because he was done with them. And so he showed an ability to be very brutal and ruthless to it, which, you know, served one purpose there, but also was a powerful deterrent message to anybody who might think about questioning him in the future, especially the execution of his uncle. Like, he was sending this message, you know, this man is so ruthless that he will dispatch with his own uncle. And I think that enabled him to prove his mettle and to be this strong leader, so that when he stood up on the stage in 2016 at the Workers' Party Congress, I was there in Pyongyang for that. I was really astonished to see this young man holding forth in front of 3,500, you know, 60-something generals and Workers' Party apparatchiks. And not just the confidence he showed, but he laid out this quite ambitious plan for economic improvements, as they call it. They don't say reform because that implies there's something wrong with their system. But he really put his name to this plan, and a 5-year economic plan, in a way that was much more bolder than his father had ever done. Also, in 17 years in power, his father spoke in public only once, and that was one sentence, you know, a little chant to the Workers' Party. So the fact that Kim Jong Un was up there, so confident, so willing to hold forth, to make himself accountable, he showed himself to be a very, very different leader from his father in particular. And of course, we only saw more and more of that as, you know, 2017 and 18 unfolded.
One of the strong themes in your book is the way in which this most closed society, the hermit kingdom, it was often called, has become more open. It's not as hermetic as it once was. And there's a younger generation, you describe in a marvelous scene how you came back to Pyongyang and saw people dressed in clothes from H&M and Zara and the stores that you'd find anywhere in the world, but certainly in China, to which some of them had traveled. And you have the sense of a momentum developing because of that. There's another marvelous detail that Anna has about people floating balloons with USB flash drives that have got on them everything you can imagine people might send across the borders. So tell us about that modernization spark, if you will, and whether you think that's what's powering at the center of Kim Jong Un's vision.
Right, so Kim Jong Un has very deliberately looked at the economy and thought about, like, first of all, when he came in, he tended to the nuclear program, of course, for several years. But he tolerated the growth of the markets there. So there are these private markets, or they're state-run but privately operated markets. The number of them has doubled under Kim Jong Un. They are now across the country everywhere. And people are like entrepreneurial in North Korea now, the state that was a command socialist economy for so long. So you see people cutting hair or selling homemade snacks or importing rice cookers and clothes and things from China and making their own living, making their own way, and increasingly independent of the state. So that is a big change, like the biggest change in North Korea in 70 years, I think, that there is this nascent entrepreneurial class, there's a growing middle class in North Korea. So across the country, more and more people are able to make their own livings and earn their own wages and buy their own food. But no one has benefited anywhere near as much as the people in Pyongyang, the 1% who keep Kim Jong Un in power. And he has very deliberately enabled them to get rich. So they are, there's a lot of corruption. People who are officials in this regime are on the take, whether they're military or party officials. Everybody's trying to earn money on the sides. But as a result, they have become richer. They have more disposable income. You can see very obvious, conspicuous consumption in North Korea now. People walk around with their smartphones and like anywhere else. I mean, these smartphones are not connected to the outside world, so they can only talk amongst themselves, but still, it looks like there is progress. And so, some of the young millennials who live in Pyongyang, which is sometimes called Pyonghatan, because of this kind of development of the elite there. They told me about all the things they can enjoy. So one of the little things, they said they love to work out and go to the gym and go to yoga classes, not because they're exercise freaks, but because that's their excuse to wear tight-fitting clothing and flirt with opposite sex. And there's like a whole gym scene in North Korea. There's cappuccino bars and things in these gyms, and there's a sense for them that life is getting closer to what they could imagine having in Beijing. I think that's very deliberate on Kim Jong Un's part, because these are the people who keep him in power, this elite in Pyongyang. And these millennials in Pyongyang are the people who could keep him in power for 30 or 40 years to come. So he's really focusing on them.
So in the arc of this story, he has planted his flag firmly. He drives quite ruthlessly toward nuclear weapons capability, the ability to deliver those weapons with missiles. And then in your story, we reach January 1, 2018. Mm-hmm. We have a new president in America. And just tell us about that turn in January 2018 and how it takes us then towards Singapore and Hanoi.
Yeah. The sign actually came on November the 29th of 2017 when North Korea conducted its last long-range missile launch. And it put out a statement that said, we have now completed our rocket program. And that word completed, to me, that was the sign. I was like, okay, they're ready to talk now, they're done. Because all he needed really was this credible threat. He needed to be able to show that he had the missiles, he had the nukes. He hadn't been able to put them together, but had defied all the expectations to create these two things. So it was reasonable to think he could if he wanted to. But this was really the signal that he was now ready for like Kim 2.0. He was ready to start talking, to embark on a diplomatic offensive, because when he took over as the leader, he revived this policy that his grandfather had introduced called the Byongjin policy. It's a simultaneous progress policy. So that was nuclear program and economic development. He was done with nuclear issues. He was now turning to the economy. And he can't grow his economy while there are all of these crippling sanctions imposed on him. And they are hurting. I think they've really hurt trade into North Korea. So he needed to try to metamorphosize into this, benevolent, charming, misunderstood dictator. And so he came out into the world. He started meeting Xi Jinping, first of all. He came to South Korea and met Moon Jae-in, and tried to present himself as a completely reasonable, responsible leader of a nuclear-armed state, just like any of the other members of the nuclear club. Of course, this was an act, but it also showed how savvy he's been and able to turn on the charm, how to push all President Trump's buttons in terms of beautiful love letters and the things that he sent him. So yeah, he has been quite savvy in the way he's done this.
So tell us how you imagine the relationship between Kim Jong Un, brutal leader of probably the world's most totalitarian state, and Donald Trump, President of the United States. There are so many different speculations in the press. Is this father-son, brother-brother, gangster, or as I teased you in the green room, is this just two guys in search of the Nobel Peace Prize? I mean, so tell us how you think about the two of them.
Mm-hmm. It was really fascinating to watch Kim Jong Un's interactions with Donald Trump, and in fact Moon Jae-in before that, during these summits. And that in Korean culture there is a lot of politeness and levels of honorifics and things. And Kim Jong Un was really playing the junior partner there. He was using very honorific, flattering language, which the translator told President Trump that he was using. He allowed him to go first, and all of these things to show that he was the junior and Donald Trump was the senior. So I think he was positioning himself in that way. But part of the, reason I was hoping my book would be able to add to some of what we know about him is because the North Koreans know an awful lot about Donald Trump. They have read The Art of the Deal. They have read Fire and Fury by Michael Wolff. I know somebody who has seen them reading this. They pass his tweets. I heard somebody who had track 2 meetings with the North Koreans, and they had this encyclopedic knowledge of everything that Kim Jong Un and Donald Trump had ever tweeted. So they have really been doing their homework and trying to figure out what motivates him and what might appeal to him. But there's very little in the other direction, right? Well, I assume that the CIA has quite a lot, but in terms of the general public, there's very little in the other direction. So I wanted to try to look at the kind of person and personality Kim Jong Un was and what his motivations are.
So let me conclude my questions with discussion of how you, in the end, assess what's ahead. And then I want to go to a couple of the good questions that we have from people who are watching this and sending them on Twitter and Facebook. What's fascinating to me about your book is that it is absolutely devastating in its assessment of this North Korean leader's brutality, but you have concluded that his opening towards the United States and the West is a serious one. You said that your feeling back in June 2018, before the Singapore summit, was maybe it's time to try something different. I had the same feeling and wrote it in my columns. But interestingly to me, your optimism about the future continued even after the Hanoi summit, widely judged to have been a significant failure. And you end your book by quoting Kim. And you quote him saying in a rare press interview he gave after the Hanoi summit, "My gut feeling is that good results will come." So take us into that, why you chose to end the book that way, what your own feeling is about the good results. And one of our Twitter questioners has said, What's this country going to look like in 10 years?
Yeah, and kudos to David Nakamura, who'll come out next, who got that answer from Kim Jong Un. That was extraordinary. You know, covering North Korea all this time, I should know better than to be optimistic, right? Like with North Korea, you have a much better chance of being right if you're pessimistic and expect everything to fall to pieces, because that has been the history. But just looking at Kim Jong Un and seeing he is so different from his father. Yes, there are some things that he does the same, but he is much bolder, he is much more gregarious. He seems to enjoy it much more than his father ever did. But I also think because he's so young, he knows that the situation of North Korea now is untenable. He needs a sense of economic growth, of improvement, of the gap between North and South Korea or North Korea and China not getting any wider, if not actually getting smaller. So I do think that he wants to try to normalize the relationship, that he would like a peace treaty to end the Korean War for once and for all. He would like to be seen as a responsible leader, you know, of like a developmental dictator like there has been in other parts of Asia and Singapore and other places. But having said that, and so that is the source of my optimism, right? Like I think he needs this process. And even today, despite the complete disaster of Hanoi, the signals are still very positive. You know, they are still talking about wanting to get back to talks. Today in Korea, Kim Jong Un sent his sister into the DMZ to present flowers to a former First Lady who died. There are these outreaches that show, even the missile launches recently, these rockets, I think were a sign of frustration. He wants the attention back on him. He wants this process to continue because I think he knows he has this very unique window of, or limited window of opportunity right now, that he has a very pro-engagement president in South Korea who has really been the glue in all this whole process, who will be out of office in 2022. He has a very unconventional American president as his counterpart who has shown a willingness to do things differently and to not listen to his advisors. And that is an opportunity for him. One of the things I did uncover during the course of my reporting was that the North Korean diplomats in New York actually went to a famous fortune teller in Koreatown and asked if Donald Trump would be re-elected. And the answer was yes. So I guess the North Koreans think they have 6 years, not 2. But they have the sense that this is an opportunity for them to strike a deal which may not still be there, you know, if there was somebody who did things more by the book in future. So I do not think by any stretch of the imagination that we are seeing a North Korean Deng Xiaoping, that he's going to try and open up the economy, that even very limited Chinese-style reform and opening, you know, that's impossible for this totalitarian state. But I think he will try to make as much progress on the economic front as he can without opening up the information deluge.
So to put the question directly, President Trump basically is making a bet, I think, that Kim Jong Un needs economic opening, certainly an end to sanctions, but beyond that, badly enough that it's a good bet to continue to engage him. Is President Trump right?
Yes, I think he's right. I think that all of the efforts over the past decades have not worked. And it's right to try something different. I think there are a lot, I do not for a second think that Kim Jong Un is going to give up his nuclear weapons, but I think there can be a different process going on. I think they should be working on opening a liaison office. It's very difficult for the two sides to talk. Like, they should be talking. So I think if they can continue this process, maybe they can make some change. And I think, you know, North Korea has survived for this long by being this hermit kingdom, by shutting the people off from the outside world and keeping them isolated. So we in the outside world should not be helping them to do that. We should be helping the North Korean people to get more information, to bring people out, you know. Why are there not North Korean soccer players coming to the US and musicians and things? Like, why is there not this people-to-people exchange that we can help open their eyes and to not allow the regime to isolate the country for decades to come.
And a final question before I turn this over to my colleagues to continue to explore these issues with Anna. The question that haunts us when we are in moments of crisis with North Korea, that I'm sure has consumed thousands of hours out at Langley among analysts, is whether Kim Jong Un, is a rational and deterrable actor, or whether he is irrational and impulsive. You probably know him better than any journalist in the world. What's your answer?
He's rational, absolutely. The proof, he's still in power. 7.5 years on, with all of these odds stacked against him, you know, this regime that must have been suspicious of him, this outside world expecting him to fail, imposing so much pressure on him to fail, and he has somehow managed to withstand it all. He could not have done this if he was not a rational actor. I mean, we should make no bone, you know, he is definitely not a good person, right? Like, this is not a nice guy, but he is. And so when I say that he's rational, I don't want anybody to think that I am sympathetic to him or in any way. But I think if you look at it from a cold political scientist kind of view, he has done everything he needs to do to stay in power, and he couldn't have done that if he was a total nut job.
Anna Fifield, a brilliant book, obviously a brilliant journalist. Thank you so much,
Thank
Anna.
you, David. Thank you very much. Thank you for the nice conversation.
So,
Thank you.
we will be right back. I think we need to let folks clear the stage and rearrange things, but this will continue momentarily.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Michael Duffy, Deputy Op-Ed Editor here at the Post, and I'm joined with a great panel to now build on that amazing conversation with Anne. David Nakamura, who is the White House reporter for the Post, Carol Morello, diplomatic correspondent, and Victor Cha, who holds the Korea Chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Thank you all for being here this morning. It's been an amazing couple of days with respect to North Korea, as David was saying, but also quite a year since, as Doug noted at the top, since the summit in Singapore. Could you talk to us a little bit, Victor, about just how things have progressed in the last year, particularly with the firing of the short-range missiles, and what this portends as we go forward for possible negotiation toward denuclearization?
Sure. Well, it's really been a roller coaster ride, I think. This started out, as some of you may remember, in 2017 when North Korea conducted 20 ballistic missile tests in the first 11 months of the Trump administration. Just by comparison, during the 8 years of the Obama administration, the North Koreans did an average of maybe 6 missile tests a year, so 20 in 11 months. It was quite a bit, and the two leaders were hurling insults at each other and calling each other names and things. And you know, I think people thought we were headed down a very bad path. And then we see this sudden turnaround of diplomacy in 2018 that has went through the Singapore summit and then ground to a halt in Hanoi. And now it looks like North Korea is back to its old behavior, which is starting to fire more missiles. I mean, I think the president continues to maintain optimism in terms of the prospects for diplomacy. Even if there is a third summit, which he's already said he wants, it's not clear if any agreements can be reached without some serious working level negotiations. You know, I did the last set of negotiations in the six-party talks, and we spent days, weeks, months, years negotiating the smaller deals, the preliminary agreements, before even considering any sort of higher level meeting. And so that's the piece that's missing right now, I think, in the diplomacy, and it's all been sort of subsumed by Trump's desire just to handle everything at the top, which we have seen doesn't work.
Do you think the short-range tests were a provocation that take us away from negotiation or maybe toward it?
It's a great question. So I think, so putting my social scientist hat on, North Korea does do provocations every time negotiations with the United States break down, usually within a period of 6 months. And then it takes us about 2.5 to 3 months to re-engage once they do those tests. This is data going back 25 years. So there is a pattern here. But what they have not done is the long-range test or another large nuclear demonstration, which may be a sign of self-restraint on their part. And at the same time, Trump is saying, these short-range tests don't matter. Of course they do matter, but he's saying they don't matter. Again, another effort at self-restraint.
Carol, there's been some confusion inside the administration about what these short-range tests mean, with John Bolton at the National Security Council saying these were definitely a breach of what the UN had agreed to before, and the president saying, well, no, this isn't something that I consider to be a breach with, in my understanding of what I've discussed with Kim Jong Un. Help us understand the confusion.
Well, I think a lot of what's going on is sort of negotiating away from the table. Since Hanoi, there really have not been many formal talks going on, although they are apparently having some low-level talks about having a third summit. But just as North Korea conducts some missile tests, they make them short range, not intermediate range. They insult Mike Pompeo and say he should be withdrawn from the negotiations, and they say they never expected anything reasonable to come out of the mouth of John Bolton, but they write beautiful love letters to President Trump. And so I think that it would be unfair to assume that the United States would start scurrying because of that. The United States keeps its sanctions up and doubles down on it. It seizes a North Korea cargo ship, but there's no sign that the United States is really changing its strategy. And so North Korea would like the U.S. to completely change its attitude, and instead of insisting on what it considers the U.S. demand for unilateral disarmament, would be willing to consider some sanctions relief and maybe a pullback in what kind of disarmament it's requiring. So that is kind of what we're seeing, is this negotiating in public, and both sides are sending conflicting signals. And we're going to see how that works. And in an odd way, I think that the administration has reverted to the Obama-era policy of strategic patience. Since the Hanoi summit collapsed, I think that they are basically trying to keep the door open to another summit, for negotiations to resume, and they are sitting waiting semi-patiently for North Korea to do something reciprocal.
David, talk to us a little bit about what happened in Hanoi. Just what happened?
Well, I think what you saw was, as Victor said, typically before a major summit between any leaders, but especially two countries that don't have a great history of deep communications, to say the least, you'd have a lot of legwork being done by actual diplomats, subject experts, and the U.S. sent a team over before Hanoi, which, if you recall, the president announced there would be a second summit, or his interest in one, with a very short time window early in the year that he wanted to do this. The U.S. sent a large team over to Pyongyang in the weeks leading up to the summit, not just with diplomats, but with nuclear experts, technical experts, to try to work out some of the details about what kind of agreement they could have, because the bar for the second summit was very different than the first summit. The first summit was historic. It was a chance to sort of say, we're going to have a fresh start. We're going to try something different. It's risky, but hey, look, it's sort of as President Trump likes the big show, so it was the big reveal. But it was a chance to sort of set some, aspirations, I guess. And that may be sort of a low, sort of a minor thing you might think in trying to get down to the details here. But on the second summit, everybody, I think on both sides, knew they had to come away with some sort of more detailed agreement. And what you saw leading up, though, was that the North Koreans, from what we understand from the U.S. side, did not want to really engage. They were not going to engage. In North Korea, there's one decision maker. I think on the U.S. side, there was a sense that, the President Trump wanted to get this done, but the U.S. came away a bit frustrated leading up to Hanoi. And I think once you got to the table, the question was, the U.S. side was suggesting maybe we will consider some sort of incremental deal, smaller deal, rather than demanding that the North get rid of their entire weapons system before any kind of sanctions relief happened. Maybe there was some intermediate step. There was a signal from Steve Biegun. He gave a speech at Stanford just in the days leading up to the summit that maybe the U.S. would consider it. But once we got into the room, it appeared that the U.S. took a harder line. And John Bolton was at the table, despite his long history of being skeptical of the talks. He may have had some influence. And President Trump did not want to go for that smaller deal. I think both sides, in the end, both leaders, because this is a leader-to-leader sort of process we've seen, both thought they could maybe get the better of the other. And I think Kim Jong Un, maybe reading some of the U.S. coverage that the president was desperate for a deal to show a win on his broader agenda as he was leading into an re-election campaign, thought he could convince the president to take some smaller deal to show progress and come away with some sort of big announcement. I think President Trump felt, he thinks he's the ultimate deal maker and that he could force Kim Jong Un to buy into his bigger vision. If you watch this, to sum up, the president talks a lot about economic investments, great beaches. This is the great prime real estate. He's putting on that real estate cap. And he talks about, they're in between China and Japan and Korea, beachfront, So, but I don't know that Kim Jong Un is thinking in those terms yet. So to me, a third summit seems almost impossible to imagine. They're talking about maybe even somehow doing it when President Trump goes to Japan and South Korea at the end of this month, some sort of meeting maybe in the DMZ. It seems like a recipe for failure. Other than Trump is such a wild card, maybe he would go for some sort of smaller deal.
I'd like to remind the audience that you can tweet questions to us using the hashtag #PostLive, and I'll pose them later to our panel if you send them in to us now or as they occur to you. Victor, do you agree with David's take on what happened in Hanoi? And also, what about the reports that followed that, which said that two of the negotiators, one, they're sketchy reports, that one had been actually executed and the other had been sentenced to hard labor, which was certainly a measure of the success of the summit, if true. But if not, what are we to make of those now, and what do they tell us about the arc we're on here?
So I think probably Hanoi was the first time in the North Korean leader's life, as chronicled by Anna, that anybody had ever said no to him. So he couldn't have been happy on that 60-hour train ride back to from Vietnam back to Pyongyang, and these two poor guys who were his, basically his envoys in the run-up to the summit, I imagine were probably sitting in the back of the train in the bathroom somewhere, trying not to be noticed. But yeah, I'm assuming that because of the failure that they did undergo some sort of re-education, if you will, and it looks like the ball in that sense has been passed to the foreign ministry, the foreign minister, and then the first vice foreign minister, who was one of the negotiators during the six-party talks, so we know these people well. I mean, that's good in a sense because they are more diplomatic. My understanding is that the conversations with some of these other folks, the ones that you mentioned, it's just not very good. They're like the worst dogmatic communists you can imagine. And these other folks are more experienced in it. They speak English. You can communicate with them. You don't always have to use an interpreter. So I think there's some benefits to that. But the problem remains the same, which is the one that David outlined, and the reason Hanoi failed is that in the end, a small deal or intermediate steps are possible if we had any confidence that the North Koreans, under this leadership, is willing to commit to really giving up all their weapons and delivery systems for entry into the international community. And there are many in the international community that are waiting to welcome them, including countries in the region, not just China, but also Japan, South Korea, international institutions. But in the end, this is a program that they have had and have been developing for over half a century, devoting the majority of their national resources. And it's very difficult for me to imagine they're going to give that all up for the economic benefits that are being promised to them. They may be willing to give up some of it, the parts they don't need, but I don't think they're willing to give up the mainstay of their program, and that's the problem.
We're going to talk about that in a second. Carol, while we're on this roller coaster ride, so are the Japanese and our allies in South Korea. How are they hanging on?
Well, President Moon, both Japan and South Korea had offered to help mediate or work in some way to get negotiations started again. But President Moon said earlier this week that that doesn't appear to be necessary to have any third-party intervention. Obviously, South Korea would like to have improved relations with the North, and it already does. And Japan is much more wary about North Korea's intentions, but even more than that, what it wants to do is be on the same page as the United States. So it's willing to go along with it. There has been some talk that, Prime Minister Abe has said he's willing to have a summit with Chairman Kim. And when both Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, and President Trump are in are in Japan for the G20. They are expected to have talks with Abe on the sidelines about this, and they will both be in Seoul and we'll be talking about this. Every party involved here seems to have some sort of motivation for this to go forward and not to collapse.
Except perhaps in some parts of the Trump administration. David, talk a little bit about the continuing, or what appears to be something of a gap between the National Security Advisor and the President on this issue.
The gap, but yeah, sorry.
Well, it's not the only place, but this is
Not the only place. You know, leading up to Hanoi, people were looking for signals whether what exactly interagency process, which sounds like a boring phrase, but for the Trump administration to be on, what page were they on? What did they want out of the second summit? And I mentioned this speech by Steve Biegun, who's the lead negotiator of the State Department, where he signaled, that the U.S. had some idea of what steps they'd like to take for a potential smaller deal. But from my reporting, there was, a meeting of all the top officials, not just the National Security Advisor John Bolton, who's had a long career of naysaying and any kind of engagement with the North, thinking it's a fool's errand. But beyond him, there was members of the State Department and Secretary Pompeo, members of the Pentagon, and almost around the table, there was a sense that that things were not going well, that they were concerned the president might go too quickly into a deal, that they were skeptical of where this process was and what the North was offering. And that they were concerned about what would happen in Hanoi, and that the president would jump at a deal because of his sort of political calculation that would help him here at home sell this agenda that he's doing something no one else had done. I mean, this is one of the big motivating factors, is that if people recall, President Obama in their first and only meeting after the election said one of the highest, the national security priority would be North Korea. That said, after this summit failed in Hanoi, I called around to folks on the Hill and others who were talking to the folks in the administration, folks at think tanks, and the message they were getting was, from what I understood, was that members of the administration were coming and briefing and saying, we all doubted this thing, and now the president sees what we saw, or what we know, is that Kim's not going to do this, and now he understands. Does he understand? Yesterday he said, going out to the South Lawn before his trip to Iowa, which I was on with him, that he had the new letter, new big beautiful letter from Kim Jong Un. So we're back to the love letters. I don't know who delivered that one, given that Kim Yong-chol, who was the guy who came with the big lottery check-sized envelope ahead of the Singapore summit to visit the Oval, is one of the guys who was said to be in the re-education program. But somehow the president has his new letter. We don't know what it is. We've seen some of the old letters. They had released one, a lot of flowery language, Your Excellency, Your Highness, epochal peace. I love the words that the North uses. I might incorporate some of that in my writing. But they're very flowery, and they play to Trump's ego. And I think it may be good. I mean, as Anna said, people would like to see dialogue, would like to see progress. So it's still ongoing. The idea that they want to re-engage. The big question is, what are they going to talk about? The issues are the same. I cover immigration too. It's like how much enforcement, how much legalization of undocumented, that balance. It's the same balance here. How much they're going to give up their weapons, how much are we going to release the sanctions? Carol, there is a long tradition in American politics and presidents of individual commanders-in-chief saying, I know what the geopolitics are, I know what the diplomats and experts are saying, but I am very good at personal diplomacy and I'm going to work my magic on this case or on that leader. Have we seen President Trump apply this template elsewhere, and with any success?
Elsewhere with any success? Well, he just recently suggested that he would be willing to hold negotiations with the president of Iran. It is not clear that that will ever happen. Iran doesn't seem to be biting, so he's trying that. But I don't know that it has worked anywhere as successfully, for lack of a better term, as it appears to have with North Korea, because there seem to be some, I won't say similarities, but the two leaders seem to be able to forge a relationship of some kind that seems to mesh with each other, and we haven't seen that work with this administration. I do think that the situation sort of underscores the difficulty of the way this administration, this president, has sort of upended the process. Normally, you would have a bunch of lower-level diplomats from the United States and North Korea sitting down and hammering out all of the details, and then the leaders would get together and they would shake hands and
bless it.
That always has worked in the past, and this has been upended. There seems to be at least a slight shift to be at least incorporating some of the more traditional ways of doing things.
Let me turn it around, since that moment that David was talking about where President Obama really did leave the Korean portfolio at the top of the pile when President-elect Trump came to see him. With 2 years hindsight, is it perhaps, are tensions less now than they were then? Would you all say they were, or greater? I was going to start with you, Victor.
So they are less in the sense that, Trump has created this personal diplomacy with the North Korean leader. He goes out of his way to defend his intentions in public. Mm-hmm. That has certainly taken down the temperature since 2017. And it's true, the only way we're going to ever get a deal with North Korea is you got to talk to the leader, because he's the only one who makes a decision. Having said that, so we are off the war track that we were in 2017. Having said that, there are substantive increases in North Korea's capabilities over the last 3-4 years. I mean, they were even doing things in the aftermath of the Singapore summit in terms of maintenance of missile facilities, and who knows what they're doing on uranium enrichment and amassing weapons. There was a report that just came out by a Japanese think tank that says North Korea has up to 30 warheads in their stockpile now, an increase of some 33%. So the temperature has gone down, but at the same time, the problem has festered. It has gotten much worse.
And maybe we should talk a little bit before we wrap up about just what denuclearization might mean, how we would define it, what we might be satisfied with, what we should think about when we use, because that's what the goal seems to be. So if you were going to define it, Victor,
so
thank
you. Thank you for asking the question, because there is there's a lot of talk about we don't agree on a definition of there is a definition of denuclearization. The North Koreans agreed to it in 2005. It is in writing, and it's that the North Koreans will abandon, quote, the North Koreans will abandon all nuclear weapons and existing nuclear programs, meaning not just the plutonium program, but the uranium program, enrichment, centrifuge, everything. That was agreed to in 2005 and 2007 in front of all the members of the six-party talks. So they have agreed to a definition. I mean, the problem is Trump thinks he can do it his own way, so he's starting all over again, recreating the wheel and trying to come up, agree on a definition, which is, of course, perfect for the North Koreans, because they would like to shave it down from what they agreed to in 2005, 2006.
I mean, if you saw on the first Singapore summit, they came away and Trump signed the big document, if you recall, when Kim Jong Un had to have a special pen because his aides concerned that there'd be poison on the pen. But they signed this document, and Trump signed it in really big letters, but he held it up, and photographers quickly shot it, and you could see it was 4 bullet points, and there was no definition. There is no definition for this administration, despite all the work that past administrations have done to try to define it, and that's the problem. And, I think there's also a question in Hanoi of whether the U.S. asked beyond ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons for the North to abandon chemical and biological weapons. So a lot of things are on the table. And, as they say, nothing's agreed on until everything's agreed on. Well, nothing is definitely agreed on.
Carol, you get the Twitter question from Hunter, which asks, which side will make concessions first? I know it's impossible to know, but what does your crystal ball tell you?
Well, first, I can't say who will do it first. My guess, if they decide to go with the normal way of things, they will find a way to do it more or less simultaneously. I think it's clear both sides are going to have to make concessions, including the United States. Many people think the United States is going to have to learn to live with some degree of a nuclear program that North Korea has. Other people say, no, it's all about sanctions. But it's clear the United States is going to have to make some tough concessions if it wants to ever have a chance at an agreement with Kim Jong Un.
Perhaps in the way it defines nuclearization.
Perhaps it would not be the first time that they shifted definitions as a way of finding a way out of a diplomatic morass.
Before I go to my last question, I want to ask David while we still have him. So tell us how you got Kim Jong Un to say what he said in the final epigram of.
I was joking that in my tombstone it'll say he shouted a question to Kim Jong Un. Here lies the man.
Set the stage a little bit. Where are you?
So I wrote a piece for WashingtonPost.com. If you want the full, I see our time's running out. The full story behind the story. But I was in the White House pool, which meant I was one of the 13 people during that Hanoi summit at the hotel. who was let into certain meetings to get the photo op because all the press corps would like to go in, but that would be unwieldy, so we would go in. That we traditionally do wait for the leaders to make some remarks or do what they're going to do on the photo op, and then generally shout out questions of President Trump. The day before, the different pool members had shouted out during a dinner and other places. The White House has gotten a little bit irritated. They were shouting out about Mueller for Trump and also some to Kim Jong Un. It was not clear what the White House was the most irritated about, or whether the North Koreans had objected to that scene. The White House had tried to block some reporters from getting into the dinner that night. They allowed us all in to this first photo op, and we had sort of discussed among ourselves our strategy, and that we wanted to go for it with Kim Jong Un. And as soon as the pleasantries ended, my colleagues started shouting to President Trump, and I had sort of aligned myself on the side of the room with Kim. And as soon as the president stopped talking, I was trying to make eye contact the whole time so he could definitely sense me, and that I would shout out. So I shouted. And I wasn't sure what would happen, but as I wrote in this piece, I said, I wanted to not start with, why do you do hard labor camps and why are you brutal to your people? I didn't know that I would get the response. I'm not trying not to be tough here, but I did say, let's keep it on the deal, right? The deal. I said, are you confident you're going to get a deal? And as he looked at me, I kind of gave a thumbs up. And as I wrote in the piece, I didn't want to get mistaken for being chummy with a dictator, a brutal dictator. But I was trying to say, sort of deal. Are you confident? Are you confident? And that's when he gave the quote. I kind of recognized I had a shot when it was interesting. If you look at the video of it, you can hear my voice come in. Trump, both leaders have their own interpreter, assigned by their government. And you see Trump's interpreter lean over and speak in Korean to Kim. And I don't know if she was taking the initiative or her role it struck me that her role might be any English spoken question or thing is then translated because she's Trump's translator and he's speaking English, she would translate into Korean. I don't know what the protocols are. I'd like to know. I'd actually like to find her because she leans over and the way she talks to him and explains what's happening, it makes it more awkward for him not to answer. And I don't know what his calculation, what his motivation was, but he did answer, and then we were quickly ushered out by the press, and we sort of put that in the pool report. What was interesting is, just to wrap up, is that in the next spray, my colleagues then, we were all emboldened, and we started shouting more, and we did end up asking about labor camps, at which point Kim tried to end the conversation a couple times. At one point, Trump was like, I want to hear the answer. And that was to whether they would open a liaison office a USC liaison office in Pyongyang, and Kim didn't want his aides try to wave it off, and then Trump said, I'd like to hear that. And then when they asked about the hard labor, I think, or something about the deal, Kim finally said something in Korean about, that's what we're here for. Like, give us a minute, which is, I guess, fair. They want to try to maybe have a discussion before.
We have about a minute left, so I will end for all of you on David's question to Kim. Will there be a deal on denuclearization, however you define it, by the end of the Trump presidency? Victor, maybe you should go first.
I think there could be one, but it would be an imperfect deal that does not really address the full threat from North Korea.
Carol?
I think there's certainly the possibility of an interim deal, not a final deal, but I would not be the least bit surprised if there's none.
And now answer your own question, Dave.
Depends on how long you define the Trump presidency. Are we talking a year and a half? Or are we talking 5.5 years? I think one thing to watch over the next several months, the North Koreans set a deadline for the end of this year for these talks to keep going, or in progress be made, or nothing's going to happen. We're in crunch time here. Also, electoral politics. If Trump needs a big moment, look for maybe a play on the peninsula.
Well, we don't have time for a full session on the impact of Korean politics on American politics, though I'm sure we could get you to stay for it. That's all the time we have for this. To watch the full playback and highlights from this morning's session, please visit wapo.backslash_postlive and follow #postlive on Twitter for future updates. And thank you, guys, and Carol,
Thank you.
For your help this morning. And thank all of you for joining us this morning.